So in this presentation I'm going to talk about the new 802.11 model, which has been started last year. First let's just look back a little bit. What was the motivation? The old model basically was a dead end because of its monolithic nature and because it was hard to change towards new features, and it was too complicated internally. So last year Anders presented a new design draft of the new model in Zurich, and shortly after that, in October, we released the first implementation. And a little bit later, it replaced the old model because it was clearly better than the old one. So the old model is gone. Ever since then, this development has been continued by Benjamin Szeregi, who is an undergraduate student of the Technical University of Budapest. So the first design draft has been significantly reworked since it was proposed, but that was necessary. So a few words about the goals. The goals didn't change much since the draft. So basically, we want to have a full-featured model which is validated, which supports, the interesting features like fragmentation aggregation, blockade agreements, and blockades and frame sequences and things like that. And we want to validate it comparing to probably other simulators like NS3 and also the old model. During the implementation, we try to focus on implementing directly the standard and trying to avoid having too much in-house build loose abstractions. Of course, we want to make it modular to support research and experimentation. So these are basically the goals of the model. This is just a reinforcement of the original goals. It's just for okay. So this slide shows the high-level architecture of the Mac. At the top level, the Mac contains an RX that basically handles the virtual network allocation vector, and the TX that basically handles things like interference spacing, and then the Mac contains several coordination functions. Each coordination function contains one or more channel access functions and a couple of procedures and corresponding policies. Policies are important for experimentation. And then we have queues and the frame sequence, which was absolutely not part of the previous model. I mean, the old model, which was dead end. And then we have the Mac data service for data transformations, and there are policies too. So basically, this slide just shows the high-level structure. It doesn't show the communication between the components, but the containment is important. It's also important to note that there are no message sent inside the Mac, so all the components communicate with each other through C++ calls. So, okay, some experimentation options. As I mentioned before, we designed the Mac with experimentation in mind, and the most obvious example for experimentations are policies that allow the researchers to try out non-standard behavior. And there are a couple of policies, just a few examples here. Like you could have custom Mac policies for long-range defeats, or custom policies for different RTS-CTS. I mean, the RTS-CTS protection to be used in different scenarios, not in the scenarios as defined by the standard, and things like that. And of course, you probably want to experiment with rate selection, which frame should go with which rate, because that's also a very non-trivial topic. Or like custom backup procedures, or new frame sequences, or new frames, and things like that. This slide shows an example how you could experiment with rate management, for example. Rate management basically consists of two components here. Rate selection is defined by the standard. The standard gives a very specific definition for the QoS and the non-QoS case. And it is basically responsible for selecting the rates based on the frame type and the receiver. Okay, and there's this other component called rate control, which limits the available set of rates before the rate selection kicks in, due to trying to optimize based on the rate on the channel quality. And both algorithms can be changed, can be experimented with very easily without touching the rest of the system. We already have a couple of implementations for rate controls, like 3 different ones, and I mentioned for rate selection at least 2 different ones. So the rest of the presentation is I'm going through all the components of the Mac that you've seen in the conceptual architecture, and trying to explain how they fulfill the goals and how they fit into the big picture. So I start first with the coordination functions, because those were, if you remember, the top level components of the Mac. So basically a coordination function is the logical unit that determines when and how station transmits a protocol data unit, and it coordinates all the communication between the subcomponents of it, the procedures and the policies and the data service and the frame sequence. The standard defines 4 coordination functions. Right now only 2 are implemented. The DCF is a distributed coordination function. That's the original coordination function that was introduced back in the 90s. And the other one is the HCF, is a hybrid coordination function, which is the new one that supports quality of services and that mixes the point coordination function and the distributed one. And the PCF and the MCF, the point coordination function, the mesh coordination function, are not yet implemented, but we are planning to do that too. They can reuse a lot of components, by the way. So at the bottom you see the coordination function is really a pretty high level concept, because all it needs to do is deal with upper and lower frames. And the thing on the right side shows the top level structure in the OMNeT for the Mac. So you see the coordination functions there and the RX and the TS. It's also important to know that this is somewhat non-standard in terms of OMNeT, that this component module is not a simple not a C module. It is using a special C++ class derived from C module, because it needs to communicate with the subcomponents through C++, so it kind of manages those. And this practice is pretty much used in many other places in this design.
Actually, it is a simple module which has sub-modules.
Yeah, you could think of it this way. Yeah.
It's an active component.
Yeah. So this is the simplest coordination function, which doesn't look that simple, but this is the distributed coordination function, and on the right side you can see it contains a couple of policies. It's pretty much similar, this policy thing that you have mentioned in your presentation earlier. And it contains a couple of procedures and then 2 data services and the channel access function. Some of these components are themselves component modules containing other simple modules that take part in the behavior of this model. And just to scare you, this is the hybrid coordination function, which is even more complicated. And because there are more policies, more procedures, and then more channel access functions, and some channel access functions are twice as deep than in the previous example. But this is necessary to have this modular structure so that we can really allow experiment without touching the rest of the system, so you can experiment with smaller parts. And also to properly implement the standard. So let me switch to channel access functions. The channel access functions basically responsible for deciding when the coordination function is allowed to access the channel. Okay, it's pretty simple. If you look at the interface, it's pretty simple. The coordination function can request the channel, and eventually the channel access function will call back that the channel is granted. You can do whatever you want. We have 2 channel access functions implemented, one for the DCF case and the other one is for the HCF CoolOS part, because the hybrid coordination function contains 2 parts. The contention base and the contention, one for the contention base and one for the contention free period. Okay? And the contention free period is not yet supported. Each coordination function contains a backup procedure. This is not new, this was part of the previous design drift, except it has been renamed since then. In the next slide, you see how the backup procedure works. It's pretty much the same, except one state is removed. but the point is pretty clear that the backup procedure can be started and eventually it will finish. It watches the state of the channel and goes into defer state, and after a certain random backup period, it will just say that it's done. It doesn't decide what to do when it's done. It's up to the channel access function. And on the next slide, it will become more clear what's the point of this modularity, because in the hybrid coordination function, it's really, the terminology is really not easy to follow, but the standard is that complicated. So in the hybrid coordination function, we have this EDCA, which is for the QoS case, and it contains basically four queues for accessing the channel, and the collision controller that resolves internal collisions, because it's also possible that the channel access functions collide, that try to access the channel at the same time in the same station. So we have to resolve that, and you can see the difference between DCF in the DCF case. Whenever the backup procedure finishes in DCF case, actually the channel is immediately granted for the coordination function. But in the EDCF case, which is part of the QoS hybrid coordination, we first have to check whether there's an internal collision, because if there's one, then there's no channel granted. Okay, the next topic is about procedures. So procedures are basically defined by the standard. We try to directly implement the procedures as they are defined, and there are even many parts which are commented from parts from the standard, so that you can understand what is the direct mapping between the two, because it's not easy to follow what's happening. There are a couple of procedure examples here, and the important part is that there's a separation of how to do something and as opposed to when to do something. And this is pretty much similar that you mentioned in your presentation, that policies are extracted from procedures so that you can experiment with policies without touching the procedures. And procedures don't really need parameters because they're actually doing something, but they don't decide when to do it. It's good to have procedures also separated, because they can be validated and implemented individually and reviewed and without worrying about the rest of the system. They are not active components. They're not controlling anything, any known process or something. They're just passive things. And the next slide, here's an example. It's a non-trivial example. It's called the recipient block agreement procedure. Recipient here means that whenever in 802.11 there's communication between stations, then one of the stations is the originator. And the originator means that the station who first got access to the channel, and the originator is required to drive the sequence of frames during the communication. And all the other stations are recipients. So this is the recipient part. And this procedure keeps track of the reception statuses for all received. All the fragments within the window corresponding to the block agreement, because the block agreement is basically block agreement is initiated between two stations for reducing the number of acts. That originally in the original DCF version there were no block acts, so every frame had to be acted individually, which was which wasn't good for the high data rates, because the ACK was taking away, the utilization was low on the channel due to the lot of ACKs. So the blocking mechanism was introduced in the standard, and this is this procedure that handles this state. This is just an example. Okay, let's go to policies. As I mentioned, policies answer when as opposed to how, and they are really meant to be easily replaceable with custom versions by the user, and they are for that purpose. They are simple modules, and it's also pretty likely. It's very likely that you will have some kind of parameters for them, and probably the parameters will vary on depending on the implementation that you choose. And for example, here you can see a couple of policies, and I will give you a couple of examples on the next slide. to make it clear. For example, there's an originator block agreement policy, which determines when to initiate a new agreement to a station and when to terminate that agreement. But it actually doesn't carry out the process of building the agreement. All it needs to do is when it wants to make such an agreement, which is not an easy decision because there are all kinds of trade-offs. I mean, if you do too much agreements too early, then you're wasting resources of the recipient stations. If you do it too late, then you're wasting resources on the channel. So it's really something to experiment with. And there's also the originator QoS ACT policy, which determines for each frame, the sender, the transmitter, should send whether the frame should be receive no ACK or should receive a normal ACK, or will receive a block ACK eventually in the future. So this is also a policy because it really depends on the circumstances what you're doing. So it's also an option for experimenting. And then block ACK request, when to send the block ACK request, that's also an interesting question. That's not these questions can be easily answered. And actually the standard doesn't answer to these questions. So it leaves it open when to do these things. The MAC data service. MAC data service is a very important part of the coordination function because it is the one that transforms the data, incoming data frames into a format that can be sent to the channel. But it's important to note that before the coordination function actually before the channel access function actually grants the channel for the coordination function, until that point of time, frames are just sitting in the pending queue. So nothing happens to them because it can be a lot of time, I mean, in terms of comparing to the transmission. So a lot of frames can arrive and just at that very moment, the MAC data service will transform these frames into the in-progress frames through using these processes and the corresponding policies. And then the frames in the in-progress frames, which is not all the frames from the pending queues, just enough frames for driving the frame sequence towards the recipient. So that's basically the purpose of the MAC data service, transforming the data frames. This is again not an in-house built abstraction. It's called MAC data plane architecture in standard. In this figure, this is from the standard. In this figure on the left side you see the transmitting part, and on the right side you see the receiving part, and then you see a couple of processes like aggregation, fragmentation, sequence number assignment, and on the receiving side you see the corresponding blocks for like duplicate removal or defragmentation or block reordering and things like that. So we really try to implement it directly so that we follow the standard precisely, and so it looks like this. You have a originator QoS MAC data service class, and it contains the corresponding members. Some are commented out because those are not implemented. There are some exotic features which are not yet implemented. There's also the mechanism that transforms the frames from the pending queues to the in-progress frames is according to the order that we've seen before. So it's very directly met. So the MAC data service is also a component module. It's again using C++ derived from C module, and it contains a couple of processes implemented in C++ classes. They don't have parameters. They just do what they're supposed to do. I mean, for example, fragmentation and aggregation deal with frame representation, but they don't decide when to do that. That's up to the policies. So fragmentation policy decides where to fragment the frames, but it doesn't know how to do it. Just as like the aggregation policy decides which frames to aggregate, but it doesn't know how to do it. It just doesn't care. So we can experiment with those. You don't have to touch the rest of the system. It just works. And then now we come to the most interesting part, I think, which is the frame exchange sequences, which wasn't even touched in the old model. The standard is pretty clear on frame exchange sequences. There's a separate Annex G in standard that is normative and that defines the allowable frame sequences using BNF grammar. And this the upper part is from the standard, and the first two line belongs to the DCF case, the distributed coordination function. The second two line belongs to the point coordination function. Here's the HCF hybrid, and here's the mesh coordination function. On the bottom of this slide, you can see the corresponding frame sequence implemented in the model, which should pretty much directly map to the first two lines. Okay, it's not immediately obvious, but we try to make it work like that. So we can guarantee that we are not going to do anything else other than what is allowed by the standard. Just to give you a feeling how it works, here's a hybrid coordination function frame exchange sequence. This is in fact a pretty simple sequence. There could be much more complicated ones. So here at the top you see the BNF grammar version. But what happens here is that we are sending a data frame, a non-QoS data frame protected with RTS CTS and with a individual act, and then we send two QoS data frames with block ACK policy, and then we just send a block ACK request and we got a block ACK response from the recipient. And in the originator, all this happens within TXO. So when the channel is granted here at this moment of time, then the originator drives the whole frame sequence without letting anyone else to use the channel. And there are TXO limits and things like that. This is just an example. So how frame sequences are implemented? Frame sequences are just C++ classes. Each coordination function has its own top-level frame sequence that directly maps the standard. And the building blocks they're using, we have one frame sequence for each BNF grammar element, like sequential, optional, repeating, and alternative, and then we have primitive ones that can be used to build complex frame sequences. You could come up with your own frame sequences, or you could extend it experimentally. And now, the last part of my presentation shows the dynamic behavior of the model. So how all these things fit together to actually give you the behavior that you expect from the Wi-Fi station. So this is a even simpler frame exchange sequence. That's just the data ACK frame exchange sequence. Actually, this is almost the simplest one. There's one simpler, which is just a data broadcast. But anyway, so this data ACK frame exchange sequence basically can be split into three parts. The first part is processing the data frame at the originator. The second part would be processing the data frame at the recipient, and the third part would be processing the ACK frame at the originator. But I left out the last two parts because it would be too much. So even the first part had to be split into 4 subparts to understand. And here you can see those. I'll go through each one of them. So this is the first part. When the data frame arrives at the MAC from the higher layer protocol, but what happens first is the MAC just decides that this station is not a QoS station, so the frame had to be sent to the DCF coordination function. And the DCF coordination function unconditionally inserts the frame into the pending queue, and then looks at whether if it has the channel. If it doesn't have the channel, then it requests the channel from the channel access function, which in turn starts the backup procedure. And what is important here is I call the backup procedure red, because that's, for example, a point where you could experiment with replacing the backup procedure with a different implementation, like not having the exponential contention window or whatever you think is appropriate. So the backup procedure schedules a message, and the whole process finishes, and then we are waiting for the backup procedure to finish, which might take a lot of time, because if other frames are coming into the MAC, then the backup procedure will hold the backup timeout. So eventually the backup procedure will finish, which ends up in the coordination function, and then in the DCF case there's no internet collision chance, so the DCF just calls the coordination function that the channel is granted. Now is the time when the frame sequence is initiated. So until this point of time, a lot of things can happen in the queues. So new frames can come in, frames can go out, whatever. Because this is important, because in the complicated case, in the hybrid coordination function, it's really important to delay all the decisions until this point of time. So then the frame sequence is instantiated, and the first step is prepared, which is at some point down, deep down, because I left out a lot of detail from here. Some point deep down calls the MAC data service to please extract the frames for me to transmit, and then all the processes come into play. And then, for example, there's another experimentation option. The fragmentation policy decides whether the frame has to be fragmented or not. And then the whole process returns, and we end up with a transmit step, which is then carried out by the frame sequence handler by calling the DCF. And then there's another experimentation option here, the rate selection, because now the DCF coordination function asks the rate selection, okay, but what rate should I use for this frame? And then the frame is transmitted. Then the frame is transmitted using the TX, frame is sent to the radio, and we are waiting for the data transmission to finish. So we are waiting for the radio to notify us. And eventually it happens, and then the coordination function is notified that the transmission is complete, which in turn ends up in the frame sequence. So the step is completed, the transmission step is completed, and we can go to the next step, whatever it is. And in this case, the next step is a reception step. We are waiting for the actor. And for that purpose, eventually a timer will be scheduled so that we can time out and abort the frame sequence if the act doesn't arrive in time. So basically, that's just the simplest part, simplest frame exchange sequence, and it's only just the first step on the originator side. Here are a couple of questions that you might think of being interesting. First of all, when it will be available, but it needs to work. We need to work a little bit on validation. It's not yet finished. That's the biggest issue right now that prevents releasing the modem. It is meant to be compatible with the old modem through a special purpose module which tries to keep the old parameterization and match that to the new one, so that you don't have to deal with the new parameterization if you don't want to. And of course, we implemented a couple of new features, not just redesigned. We implemented the block mechanism completely, and then we have MSD aggregation. MPD aggregation wouldn't be a big deal. It's not yet implemented. We still have a lot of missing parts, but we are planning to do that. It's also interesting to know that it would be an interesting question that whether if can I build a simplified Mac that is simpler than the DCF case, but because even the DCF case is too complicated just to experiment. Of course you would. So we are also trying to make a simplest coordination function which leaves out all the details so that you can experiment with that. Yeah, I think that's it. Any questions?
How long did it take to study all the standards and all the books that are prepared, all the policies that are mentioned over there?
How long did it take to read it?
Yeah, to read it and then to implement it, because I can imagine it was
It took a
kind
lot.
of painful
Standard is
process.
like 2,500 pages. It's extremely long and extremely complicated, and it's really, every once in a while you just realize that there's a paragraph that tells you something new, and then, oh, I didn't think about that. Okay, now, so it's kind of like that. Yeah, it's really complicated, but luckily I mentioned that the undergraduate student is really talented, so the work I presented here is mostly done by him under my supervision. He's very talented.
I'd like to answer some concerns with us. So you might ask, okay, why do we spend that much time on a single protocol? Okay, why it everywhere, basically? It's like Ethernet. And it's wireless networks are everywhere. We absolutely need. Okay, why is it so complicated? The standard is evolving at really a breakneck pace. So this was the 2012 version.
2012.
And like every 2-3 years, there comes the next version of the standard.
Like 10 and
1.5 times as long, but why they are keeping adding features, new and new features. And really the only way to keep up with it is just to keep everything modular and then stick to the word of the standard, because this is the way you do I need all of this? No. So the whole point is basically to provide a set of building blocks that one can use to build a fully compliant Wi-Fi Mac. But if you just want to use a simple ICF, then you can throw out like 80% of these blocks and you end up with a compound module with a few building, and at least that's the purpose. Okay. Another question, what does it mean for performance to have so many buildings? Basically, if we have a lot of simple modules, that doesn't mean much for performance because all the code is still using C++ method calls. For C++ method calls, it doesn't matter whether they go across module boundary or they do not. It just allocates memory, but like for wireless networks, it's not like we can simulate a million network connections. So it's not really.
And then you can parameterize them and you can inspect the state of the simple modules. There are lots of good things that come from the user interface. So there's a good reason for doing
Yeah,
that.
I was not asking like that why is the code so complicated. I understand it must be so complicated. I was just asking what amount of work was it?
Just very brief questions. In the third page, major code is full featured and validate model. And I'm just curious how you validate.
I did a validation comparing to NS3, and actually I could run a non-2, 3, or I don't know, couple of non-trivial simulations where the two simulator behaved exactly the same way in in terms of timing and number of frames and frame types and things like that. It's not practically, and they also compare it with the old version, whether if it still has the same behavior as the old version. I mean, in terms of fingerprinting and things like that. But we didn't do any testbed comparison. If you are asking for that, because we don't have the resources for that.
Yes, I definitely understand because validation of the communication protocol is so complicated.
Yeah.
So,
but modularity also helps that because then smaller parts can be validated against the standard. And as I mentioned, the code is full of comments, exactly copied from the standard and with page numbers and things like that. So this implements that part. And we really try to focus in that, for example, if it can be implemented in a single function, that certain part that is written by the standard, then we do it that way so that you can read the text and look at the function and say, okay, it exactly does what is written there. So we really try to do this wherever it was possible.
yes, but at the same time, dynamic behavior of the protocol.
Yeah,
We have to deal with this in a huge space of the possible kind of
states.
And when we say that, okay, it's fully verified, then is that we just cover 100% of all this possible space. So whenever, for example, to formal verification of the communication protocol, the typical outcome is, okay, maybe 80% of the possible this protocol space is checked and verified. So we just compare this OMNeT++ implementation with the existing NS2 or NS3 implementation.
I wouldn't say that NS3 is any way better in terms of quality. I've seen the code inside and it's no. So I would say it's certainly worse.
No. The only maybe major, not major issues, not stronger work. But chances are you do your best, but chances a certain space of this dynamic status may never visited.
Yeah.
Am I right? Even though you just do your best to exactly implement.
I can't guarantee you that all the possible dynamic states are visited. I can't guarantee that. But for example, the frame sequences are very important because the standard is really clear. It's normative, that part, and that was completely left out from the previous one. So it was like the frame sequences, the possible frame sequences were kind of luckily falling out. Whether they were correct or not, nobody knew it. I mean, at least it enforces it. So yes, you are right. So it's not easy to do this.
I'm just always thankful for the OMNeT++ and this is maybe another area for an improbable contribution from the academic side, especially formal verification is a huge area for computer science people.
I'm not sure if the 802.11 can be formally validated in any way, because it would be like,
Again, I'm sorry to say a lot of my older days, but back in 1990s, we developed use SDL, specification distribution language, and then this company actually, from Swedish company, came to the Bell Labs, and then they actually saw automatic verification tool. So
There is an SDL description.
in the standard, which is,
Yes,
There's an appendix.
there is an SDL
There's
description.
also basic PCF.
No, actually that's incomplete. Not even incomplete, that's also incorrect. So if you look at the standard, there's an annex in the standard that contains an SDL description, and it isn't maintained anymore, because they just realized that it's so complicated that the standard would be like 5,000 pages, and even in that case it would be complete and validated. So it's incomplete, they actually admit it, it's incomplete, and it's also incorrect. It's pretty easy to find bugs in there, so it's like they just left it there for educational purposes, or I don't know.
God, it was the work of one guy who at least 1 year, you know, like
Probation. He just went.
sentiment value.
Yeah.
For example, in AOTB, which has a much simpler protocol stack, has never been satisfactorily formally clarified. They've tried it at Solid, they've tried at NICTA, at AOTB, which is a very simple routing protocol, they still haven't successfully formally clarified it. So I think it's just not feasible. But I like this cross simulator, like verification by a cross simulator. I think is really useful, because
For that period, it wasn't even hard. I mean, I only had to, synchronize random number generation and have the same applications, and then I could just look at what happens on the median, and if the same thing happens, then we are pretty much clear. If not, then I have to investigate deeper which one is wrong or right or what.
Because a lot of the real implementations of 802.11 are known to be broken.
Yeah.
You're verifying against real hardware means that you may just be trying to be bug compatible with some particular manufacturer.
When I was
there are
looking-
a lot of known errors in existing.
Searching on the internet for PCAP-files, for example, or 802.11 PCAP-files to see a certain scenario how it happens in real life. Actually, I was getting PCAP-files which were wrong, because it was the talk about the issue was like my real Mac is stuck. I mean, like you have 4 QSQs and one of the queues just stops. It doesn't communicate anymore. That was the reason for the PCAP-file being on the internet. So it was, even in the real life, you can't be sure it first implements the standard.
It's something that would be really useful to have for the community, not just for 802.11, but for some of the other low-level 802.15.4 and other low-level wireless protocols. Isn't so much a verification as a characterization. I think it would be nice for the community to have available information about how the implementation behaves in very simple scenarios. So the sorts of things that were in the tutorial, error rates at different distances and transmit colors.
I think we.
Rate changes under various conditions. So it's not so much a question of knowing that it's verified to match.
This would be a really good contribution if you.
I think that would be, and I think a lot of it is actually already done to some extent in these very simple examples. It's just a matter of working how they're presented a little bit. But this idea that you can say, because then you present some simulation results, some simulation scenario, and you can say, so look, you say, okay, I'm spreading nodes with an average distance of this and this and that and that. But you can say, here are these very simple scenarios, and we can say how the simulator behaves. And I think there's some context, we're looking at much more complicated results to say, what are the underlying behaviors that affect this more complicated scenario if you have good characterization of simple scenarios.
There is a very simple scenario, for example, a simple example that compares the throughput between 2 nodes with normal accuracy, and you can analytically compute the throughput. And of course, the simulator matches that exactly. I mean, that's a simple case, but you're absolutely right. It would be really
that would be
great.
more useful to the community than trying to do some abstract formal method verification that nobody will, it's hard to understand. Just say, okay, attach this wireless model, show how it behaves, and then people have some kind of a mental model for how the network is behaving in simple cases, and then that gives you more confidence that they're seeing sensible results in when you then model some very fancy handover
us to write a tutorial to make it to the
Have you ever tried to test or implement the module or unit level verification? Going back to my previous example, when you developed, for example, the first ever password optical network system, even before actual conflict system, okay, so we have some software implementation, then we just consider this as a black box. In this case, we have the network for unique or classes as black box. Then we generate, we also implement another software, definitely excluding all the networking or channel whatever, but we're just taking this main module as a black box. And actually at the time I was using particularly to generate the lots of the messages. So you don't need any other module layer or even network whatever. But here is actually the map. There's the gateway or interface, am I right? And there's a module or unit tester. And based on certain scenario, it just generates simply internal message. This is nothing to do with the outside the real message. I don't know. Just trying to test that this module is.
You mean the individual parts, or?
Yes, it's something similar to module testing or unit testing.
Yeah, that's can be done.
Have you considered about that? Because to build scenario testing is too bulky and it takes a lot of time until you have all the modules that you can even start, am I right? But this module unit testing, even before all other physical.
Yeah, we are just not there yet. I mean,
Okay.
material.
In that case, it's not trivial to generate the actual packet. I mean, the traffic pattern to test the module itself.
Well, again, definitely we cannot cover 100%, but at the time we just, for example, come up with the most plausible and typical scenario first of all. Then based on that scenario, we just generate a certain sequence of internal messages for that module. That was done by Virdis. Then we also some how can I say, prepare the possible expected outcomes from that module. Then we just compare each other. This is again nothing to do with actual real or whatever, completely module or unit level.